Lex Lasry, Supreme Court judge for 11 years, coming up to 50 years in the law, retired on Friday. And he's with me in the studio. Lex Lasry, good morning.
Good morning, Neil.
Do you carry justice with you forever?
Absolutely.
Oh, Justice Lasry in the studio.
No, well, I actually don't know. The Honourable I think you carry forever. As I sit here, I'm not a judge, so I don't think justice is an appropriate title.
There's a number of, I'd like to pursue some of the issues around the law and then talk about some personal issues.
Sure.
But at this stage, are you out, or you intend to continue as a reserve judge?
Well, that's my intention. Having said I wouldn't, when I came face to face with leaving the court, I found that very difficult. So my position now is that if the government would have me back as a reserve judge, I'd be happy to serve, yes.
I'll be surprised they don't. That's good to hear. I've never known such a period of criticism of judges as we're undergoing at the moment. Have you?
No, I don't think so. I think probably because I've been a judge, I've been conscious of it. But no, we do seem to cop a fair bit of criticism.
Why?
Well, I think probably some of it's out of ignorance, in the sense that people don't really understand how the process works, and in a sense the court carries some responsibility for that. We need people to better understand how we do the work we do. So what they see, particularly in criminal law, is the number at the end, the sentence, and they know what the offence was, and they have trouble reconciling the two.
There is a fear in the community of crime at the moment. Where
Yes.
we're going, and that's not unprecedented, but it's pretty intense at the moment. And a criticism of sentencing. Is sentencing? It strikes me when I've looked at the figures that sentencing actually got tougher over.
Yes, it has. There's no doubt that it's got tougher. But I think people understandably see increases in particular aspects of criminal activity and think the only way to fix it is higher sentences. And of course, there's a real debate to be had about that.
Well, what's your view?
Well, it has to be done, but it's not the complete answer. There are a lot of other issues involved in crime. Crime is primarily a social problem. We need to understand why crimes are occurring as well as punishing them.
Now, that sounds like a soft approach. I hasten to add that you're responsible for some of the toughest sentencing we've seen. What sort of cases?
Well, some of the, I don't want to go to individual cases, but some of the cases where I thought the brutality of the offender was almost unbelievable, I have imposed very heavy sentences. There are a couple of cases where I thought I'd never be shocked. I've seen a lot in 50 years, but a couple of them really shocked me. And I think there are cases, Neil, where the community's entitled to be protected from some people, possibly indefinitely, as I said at my farewell on Friday. And if that has to be done, it has to be done.
When a case shocks you, and I read this in John Sylvester's piece of the weekend, judges have a game face.
Yes.
You're sitting on the bench.
Yes.
I do remember a couple of exceptions where judges have actually shed a tear. But how do you keep that game face on?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I have a couple of times walked into court anxious about the prospect of losing it, particularly in cases involving children. And somehow, when the process starts, that emotion shuts off. And I do believe, excuse me, very strongly that if you can't keep your emotions under control, you can't do your job properly. And there's some mechanism in me that just enables me to do it.
Mm. Do you react to it later?
Yes.
How?
Not with tears, and that's by no means a criticism of those who do, but certainly there's a knot in the stomach and there's a really sad feeling about some cases that stays with you for a while.
Remember Justice Frank Vincent, who I was talking to on Friday night, I remember him shedding tears a couple of times when he was sentencing people.
Yes.
Well, because obviously you're sentencing, you're describing the nature of the offence, and that's why he was crying. That's why he was shedding a tear. He wasn't shedding it for the person he was jailing. But is it negative? Why do you say it's very important that? Is it a negative thing that such emotion is shown because it shows that judges are human?
No, I don't think it's negative. As I said, I don't criticise those who show it. I just choose not to do it that way. And I might say it's true that the emotions are usually generated by what has happened to the victim. But when we sentence people in court, Neil, we look them in the eye and we're talking to them direct. And it's not easy to tell a person they're going to spend the next 20 or 30 years in custody, no matter what they've done. That is not That is not something to be flippant about, and I think a lot of judges feel the same way about it. It has to be done, there's no question, but it's not easy.
What do you see when you look into the eyes of an offender like that?
Sometimes desperation, sometimes indifference, sometimes even a brave smile, occasionally emotion, but only occasionally. I think people prepare themselves for what's coming and determine in a similar sort of way, I suppose, not to show emotion. It's amazing how often you hear in a high-profile case that someone's been sentenced to life imprisonment and showed no emotion. It's something they prepare for. But at the same time, you're speaking to another human being and you're telling them their liberty is gone, possibly forever. I've never found that easy.
Do you see hate or resentment towards you individually?
Do you know, I never have. I really haven't. At the bar a couple of times, particularly if I was prosecuting a case, I felt that there was some personal hostility. But in my time at the court, I can't think of a case where I felt that there was hostility directed at me because I was doing my job as a judge. I think people accept that we're there to do a job and we're doing it. It's really as simple as that.
So is security an issue for judges?
Well, it is.
On and off, I suppose.
It is. It never has been for me. I mean, for example, in the family court for a time it was, and a couple of family court judges were murdered. But I've never had any sense of a security problem as a Supreme Court judge.
There is a political frenzy around the crime issue at the moment. Maybe it's settling now because crime figures are coming down, but there's certainly been something of a bidding war between government and opposition. Who can be tougher? Who can get tough on crime? Now, I know politics is an area, even though you are no longer on the bench, you won't be keen to get into. But what's your general reaction to that?
There are times when I'm dismayed about the political debate about crime, but at the same time I do reassure myself that by and large politicians on both sides of the aisle are there to do the best they can for the community. And I think that's got to be kept in mind. So in the end, judges have to work with the laws that Parliament passes, and if one political party is in the ascendancy and wins government and passes, contentious criminal justice laws, well, the court simply has to put up with it because that's obviously the will of the people.
Your view of mandatory sentencing, because the opposition is unequivocal on what seems to be black and white mandatory sentencing.
Well, I obviously disagree with it. I've said so many times, and I recently heard Chief Judge Kidd in this very studio talking to you about it. His summary of individualised sentencing and the way sentencing works and the unintended consequences of mandatory sentencing is something I agree with. There will always be cases because one size doesn't fit all. The whole point of individualised sentencing is to enable a sentence to be passed which is appropriate in the particular case. You simply can't generalise across all offenders for a particular offence.
Is it interfering with the independence of the judiciary?
It's taking away discretion. I don't know about independence, but it's taking away. Sentencing carries a lot of discretion as far as judges are concerned. It interferes with that discretion.
Do you think it could lead to the resignation of judges?
It might. I can't speak for them, and I've never really discussed it. I mean, for example, there may be some who have a very strong view. If this isn't going to happen, but if it ever got to the stage where I'd been a judge on the Supreme Court and a government had said we're going to reintroduce the death penalty and succeeded in passing it, I would have to have left. I couldn't have stayed for that. So there may be some who feel the same way about mandatory sentencing, but I don't know, and I haven't had those discussions.
Do you feel that strongly about mandatory sentencing?
I feel strongly about it enough to be involved in the discussion about it, but we already have it, in some cases. The one punch.
There's some discretion there, though. Oh, sorry, the one punch.
The one punch offences. I mean, if the prosecution can prove the things they have to prove in a given case, then the judge must impose a minimum of 10 years imprisonment. I recently had a case where that might have applied. I would have gone ahead and done what I had to do. So the answer to your question is probably no, I'd probably stay.
Do you think it will make any difference to the crime rate?
No. No, I don't. I really don't. Some people will feel better about the sentences, but it's not going to make a difference, no.
What would make a difference?
I think what makes a difference is social policy, and I think what makes a difference is things like the effort that goes into dealing with the effect of drugs and personal conflict and domestic violence and those kinds of things, solving some of the problems that are at the basis of criminal activity.
Are cultural issues important in all this? Certainly that we've seen a disproportionate numbers of young Sudanese or men of Sudanese background
Yep.
and general African background involved in crimes, and they're disproportionate.
Yep.
Not huge, but disproportionate. Are these an issue for us?
Are these an issue?
Yeah.
Well, it's certainly an issue. And the question is, why is it happening?
Yeah.
And the question is, why are so many young Sudanese boys feeling so disconnected from the community they live in that they feel they must or want to act as violently as they do? There's got to be a social solution to that problem.
We often get a message the courts don't take enough consideration of victims and victim impact statements. Do you think there's some fair criticism there?
I think it's relatively speaking an unfair criticism, Neil. I think victims, certainly in my court, victims have always been present. We've always received the statements. I've always read them. I've always declared that I take them into account. I've always made comments about the suffering that victims feel, and I think most judges feel the same way. It was a pretty unfriendly place for victims for quite a long time, the courtroom, and I think that's changing, and I think it's changing quite quickly.
We'll take a break, come back with more from Justice Lex Lasry, or the Honourable Lex Lasry, in a moment, and then we'll move on to a couple of other issues I want to do. But I want to sort of look at the personal side of Lex Lasry too. 50 years in the law.